The story of Pharloom is not one single story, but the culmination of many threads tied together through the actions of the Citadel. And one plotline that many people picked up on was the Citadel's destruction of the natural world. However, I think that the destruction of the natural world can be seen in many more forces than just the Citadel. Two regions that exemplify this the most, that many people don't talk about as much as I think they should, are the Marrow and Deep Docks. These two regions almost immediately tell a player that this kingdom is both more lively and dead than its predecessor ever was. So let me be your guide through these scorched lands and tell you the subtle tale of a land that is slowly being erased. When Hornet first arrives in the Marrow, it presents itself as a harsh land unfit for life. Harsh gray caverns, no water in sight, and the bones of beasts long dead. However, the ferocity of this land is immediately squandered by one lively little pilgrim. Sherma instantly tells the player that while these lands are harsh, they're not really a threat to those who pass through. This is further shown with the enemies of the region. The biggest threat of the entire area, the Skull Brute, are no taller than Hornet herself and aren't exactly the most tactically minded foe. The idea that these lands are untouched is fully disproved when Hornet passes the combat arena to the first bench. Pilgrims now litter the region almost as, if not more common than, the natural life of the region. This tells the player that the natural world is not respected by Pharloom as a whole. At the east end of the Marrow lies the iron fort that separates the wild lands of Farfield from itself, the Deep Docks. Deep Docks is both contrasted by and similar to the Marrow. The floors and walls are harsh, natural fauna is sparse, the music that plays features the rhythmic clangs of hammers. It echoes of the Marrow, harsh lava-filled land with little fauna and many sentient bugs around. By now, the player is fully engrossed in the industry of the Citadel, all but forgetting the nature that they started off with. This is then brought to their attention when you swing up to the Hunter's March to get Swift Step. Now, the player is reminded that the Deep Docks is nothing but a blight on the natural order of the world. With Swift Step in hand, Hornet crosses paths with Lace for the first time, and with her defeat, crosses into the greenery of Farfields. The player now can once more witness the natural order of the world as they work through the sparse infrastructure of Farfields. With that, I think it's best to travel back to the Marrow to assess the damage that the Citadel has done to this place. The Marrow is a critical path for both pilgrims of Pharloom and the industry of the Citadel, and they work together to erode these lands for their own benefit. The first of these forces are the Pilgrims of Bonebottom. While these pilgrims may seem innocent, they have left quite the impact on these lands. The Marrow has been carved out for them, seen in the many structures throughout. The Shard Pendant Hut, the small room with the Rosary Chest, the hut on the northern edge with the Memory Locket and Arena, along with many benches and footpaths mark almost all of the Marrow. The Pilgrims of Bonebottom also actively seek the death of natural fauna of the region, requesting the death of flint beetles and the Skull Tyrant. It's also worth bringing up the small bits of Bellheart that straddle the edge of the region. While not actively expanding, it's worth noting that they could claim a little more of the Marrow pie given a few Bell avalanches from either Pilgrim or Bell Beast. Of course, we can't ignore the worm in the room that is the Deep Docks. I think it is clear that the workers there are slowly expanding into the area due to its relative accommodations compared to its other neighbors. This can be seen in the room right before the Deep Docks with the pillars and platforms. Many people argue that these are the broken remnants of a bridge. However, I think that they are instead what will be an expansion to Deep Docks. This also checks out if you think about what Deep Docks is. Being a mine, it has to have stuff to mine. So expanding is not only for more space, but also so that they can continue operations. This means that not only does Deep Docks represent the threat to the Marrow, but also what it will become in time. However, what if I told you that Deep Docks is not the greatest threat to the long-term survival of the Marrow? These regions represent the defiling of the natural order of these lands. Let's take a closer look at the Marrow's much more insidious neighbors. The marrow is being desecrated by many forces, both constructed and grown. However, that of the lands presenting as nature is a much greater threat to the marrow's survival than the industry of deep docks. The first of these is the moss lands. In the very first room, the western wall is coated with a thin patch of moss. The moss is unassuming, however it will choke out the natural life in a heartbeat to make way for the vast broods of the moss mothers. The next region is that of Hunter's March. A small burrow that leads into the core of the Scar land is placed on the eastern front, not far from deep docks. The Scar are perfectly willing to conquer these lands if it means growing their tribe. Finally, there is Shellwood. In the northernmost room lies the vines of Shellwood dangling temptingly above the bugs of the marrow, ready to pounce when their roots grow into the calcified walls of the region. By now, many of you have written comments saying that these lands are natural, nothing like the Citadel or the Pilgrim's expansion. However, I would argue otherwise. Hunter's March is the result of the Scar, who are anything but mindless fauna. They are fully capable of shredding the land if they so choose, as they are by far the strongest regional power, even compared to deep docks, since they have a strong foothold on the northern end. The Scar are seemingly born of Carmelita, who is the source of Farfield's growth. They straddle the line of a full-fledged civilization on par with the Pilgrim settlements and that of the natural species like the wildlife of the marrow, albeit leaning more towards civilization. Shellwood is certainly not a civilization. However, being born of Nihilith, it also clearly is not the natural state of the region. Notably, the room where Shellwood meets the marrow, there is similar architecture to that of the Chapel of the Witch, perhaps implying that at one point there was an active effort for Shellwood and its semi-inhabitants to expand into the marrow. Finally, the hardest example is with the Mosslands. This is much harder to argue with the naturality of the Mosslands, since there is no obvious source of its creation. However, you could perhaps point to the Druids as the source. The Moss Druid, being the last member of a guild, seems to have been here for a while, having no clue about how Moss Home or the Weaver Burial surrounds them. They also directly mention the Hearts of Karak, Shellwood, and maybe Farfields, showing that they know the semi-unnatural forces of Pharloom. Finally, with all the moss berries, they create what seems to be a heart of moss, slowly beating away in their cauldron. However, even if you ignore these connections and say that the Mosslands are perfectly natural, they're still a great threat to the marrow. Consider Bone Bottom. The moss only just stops at the camp's edge, as if the pilgrims trim it like grass. It also overtook Moss Home above, perhaps after the pilgrims left. I think this shows that without the resistance of the pilgrims, the Mosslands would eat the marrow like every other region. However, even after that, one threat still remains to the marrow: the depths of the world that stretch across kingdoms, the Abyss. The Abyss threatens all of Pharloom in Act 3, but I think it further adds to the devouring of the marrow. The Void is able to target the few natural gaps left in the place, infecting the few denizens with Void Thread. However, I wonder if the Abyss could perhaps destroy the marrow like the other regions. Consider that in Hollow Nest, the ancient basin seems to be built partially out of stone made of void. Perhaps this could infect the stone, slowly spreading up from the Void Sea. Lava is also not a threat to the Void, since it seems to be able to grow vine-like structures to block off lava flow, as seen above the diving bell in the Abyss. With the Abyss added to the list, you may have realized the marrow is being hit on all sides. North, south, east, or west, they all have something slowly breaking the region down. And I think that summarizes this topic well. The forces erasing Pharloom are not only from the Citadel, but also its seedy underbelly of the bygone kingdoms and regions of eras past and present. The Pharloom before Grandmother Silk was no better in this regard. Tyrants still ruled, hive minds thrived, and they still took over lands that had no business being conquered. Only when Hornet rejects her divine nature can the cycle be stopped for a time. Yet that cycle will repeat. It is the nature of higher beings to conquer, and they'll crush anything that opposes their will. And with that, thank you so much for watching. I hope the scripted format did well. I am not much of a script writer, so I hope I didn't sound too robotic throughout the video. Thank you so much for sitting through, and hey, if you liked the Silksong content, please leave a like and whatnot, because that will genuinely make a difference in what I make. So if you want to see more, leave something down below. I would love to see what my audience thinks about this. So with that, thank you so much, and I'll see you in the next video.